Welcome to Managing Love Intelligently. I'm Jason.
And I'm Stephen Ng.
And Steve has been a marriage and family therapist with a background in forensic work for the past 30 years. And he's here to hit you with all the all the good information.
I promise I will not hit anyone.
How this works is I present a topic to Steve, which I have planned ahead of time, but Steve has no idea about, and we talk about it for an hour or so. And today's topic is our collective discomfort with sex.
Wow. I thought you were going with the verb, and then I realized, okay, it's the possessive pronoun. That means all of us.
All of us.
Yeah, all of us in America? Or?
Yeah, we'll do America. We'll start there.
Just 300 million and change.
And before we kick off the conversation, if you have a question for Steve, visit stephening.com and fill out the contact form. At the end of each episode, Steve will answer your listener questions, so stay tuned for that. And if you enjoy the podcast and find the information helpful, please subscribe and share it with your friends and family. And if you really enjoy the podcast, please consider leaving a review. So, yes, I want to talk about our society here in the United States and our relationship with sex. You've mentioned this a few times, I don't know, maybe through other episodes or just talking together about the collective discomfort we have around sex. And on one hand, in our country, sex is everywhere in advertising, media, billboard, magazines, porn, you name it. But on the other side, it's this thing like we're not supposed to talk about. And there's religion that kind of suppresses it. And so what is your ideas behind this collective discomfort?
Say something smart right now, Steve.
Yes.
So, yeah, I've been actually thinking about this a lot because of actually Sigmund Freud. And I'm working on a new book. And I think this all goes back not so much to the Puritans, like so many people say, but I would say to the Enlightenment, that period of time when science really started taking off and getting taken seriously. And there were writers like Edward Gibbon, who wrote The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire, and in his 8-volume work was able to explain 1,000+ years of history without ever once referencing God. And that was kind of the heart of the Enlightenment, is what are the natural explanations for things that are happening in our lives? And I think all of that, of course, is probably going to go back to the book On the Nature of Things by Lucretius, as documented by, in the book Swerve, by Greenblatt, I think. Anyway, I just, I think it all goes back to sort of an accommodation. If you remember from history, those of you listening, there was a time when Spain and Portugal carved up the world and pretty much gave half the world to Spain and the other half to Portugal. And during the Enlightenment, there was a tussle between those who were on the side of rationalism and those who were on the side of religion. And religion agreed, more or less, with the Enlightenment that you keep the hard sciences, including physics and chemistry. We'll give you mathematics, but we're going to keep human nature, morality, ethics, and sexuality as part of that. And ever since then, psychology has been sort of the bastard stepchild of the sciences and not really accepted as a real science by so many. And that's why when you go to Freud, you see these very odd Greek mythological terms like Oedipal complex or other terms that he uses to try to explain human nature. And in a very unscientific way, with a sampling size of, I think, under 10 people to base all of his theories upon. And so you look at that and you think, okay, that kind of gets us off to a bad start where we don't even understand ourselves. There was a poet, Alexander Pope, I think his name is, who said the proper study of mankind is man, not the number of angels on the head of a pin, not the nature of God or any of that, but really to understand ourselves. And it's really, if you think about it, sort of the last thing that's on our minds to understand. And I think that's one reason why so many Americans are still very uncomfortable with the biological theory of evolution. And I was told just the other day by one of my clients, well, I'm not an animal. And I said, what do you mean you're not an animal? I thought, aren't we all animals? He said, no, I'm a human. And I said, and one of the other guys in the group sort of rescued me and said, but we're mammals, right? And the guy said, yeah, well, all mammals are animals. Mammals are animals. And that was the end of the discussion as far as it went. But when it comes to human sexuality, it's been in the hands of all the different religions of the world, and no one has ever really delineated any kind of theory about humans having sexual needs. It's always needs. When it comes to sexuality, the word need has always been defined as that which the organism requires in order to survive. Therefore, you don't have any sexual needs. You're not going to die if you don't get it. People will talk like that. When actually, in our language, we easily and comfortably use the word need to pertain to that which the organism requires in order to thrive. So we say children need an education, children need time to play, everybody needs friends, everybody needs to develop a career. And those are things that without which we will not die the next day. But we need those things in order to thrive. And I would say sexually, we have a number of needs that are more under the category of thriving, but that's, and that would be in my book, We're All Like This. But when we talk about it in terms of dating and romance and love, so often the conversation, if you even use the word need, it comes up as a source of conflict. Where is that all you men ever think about? Well, I'm not doing anything right now. I don't care what your needs are. And so we just seem to have no scientific basis for a common understanding of our sexuality. And I think that makes it really hard. And it frankly is influenced strongly by religion, which treats sexuality as something that can be indefinitely repressed without harm. But if you look at American society, it's a society that shows the signs of what happens when a large group of people repress sexuality, and they end up behaving very oddly and strangely in a collective sense because of the way that we do handle our advertising and everything else related to media. We can't seem to sell even hamburgers without making it a sexual moment. And because sex does sell, but it especially sells, I think, for those of us who are starved for sex or who are unhappy with our sexuality. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of where Americans are. We guess at what normal is. Mm-hmm. We don't really know what normal is.
Yeah.
And when I know that we're all very individualistic and we are all very different one from another, that is a truth that is undeniable. It is simultaneously true that we are all far more alike than we are different. Mm. So both truths have to be held in common. And people like Kinsey, the researcher on sexuality from, his latest work was in the 50s. He was on the right track. He just started studying and publishing numbers and how many people like this and how many people like that. And that was not very long ago. I was born in that decade. And so the idea that we've only just started studying our own sexuality, that's kind of crazy. And then, modern history has one researcher after another trying to understand it a little bit more. But all of those researchers are treated as if they've been doing something naughty or wrong, and they've gotten a lot of disapproval over the years. So even saying, well, we're all sexual beings, that's a hard truth for a lot of people to accept and to embrace. And I think here's a stretch. I think we're going to get some male questioning me on this, but we as a group here in America, we're going through an environmental crisis, and not just in America, but of course the world, with global warming. And there's so many different pieces of this, but we essentially haven't quite seen our place in the natural order. We haven't seen our place in the wilderness. We don't see our interconnectedness with all of the other life forms on this planet. And I think part of that is because our own biology is so off limits. We have such a hard time seeing our own wild nature, that would be the wildest part of ourselves being our sexuality, that we can't really understand nature and wilderness itself. So if I can't even understand myself, how could I understand nature itself? And how could I revel in it and savor it and enjoy it when I can't, or when I'm disallowed from enjoying my own wild nature? So we turn it into something that's nasty, naughty, forbidden, or just comedic. And it has hurt us to look at sexuality in this way. So collectively, I think that becomes an enormous problem in our society. Yeah. And it's one of the important reasons why I think we should all start talking about human sexuality, because over time, if we continue talking, we will become far more intelligent about managing not only our sexuality, but our love lives.
And then do you think that that's one of the ways of shortening this gap as far as having conversations around these things in a comfortable, accessible manner?
Well, are you saying would talking about it help decrease some of the anxiety and discomfort?
Yeah, like how do you close that? Because we have it, it's there. I mean, I think it's shown, and I mean, just life, divorce rates, relationships. And
well, maybe not in all groups. I don't know if Presbyterians are sexual beings. But,
well, for the most part, I mean, it's how then they're going to die off, because if they're not having sex, then,
Yeah, and that actually happened to groups that completely repress sexuality, like the Shakers. As a religious group, they died out for that exact reason.
Yeah, because it's like, that's how we are brought into this world, through the act of sex. So it's like, we can't, right?
Yeah, I touch on this subject from time to time, and it seems overwhelmingly daunting to me at times, but I'm determined to try to make a change. Even my own profession, marriage and family therapy, that's my licensure, and there are lots of us out there. But generally speaking, at least in my experience, marriage requires some sort of sexual connection, and family definitely seems to require somebody having sex with somebody at some point.
Yeah. But most people too, really quick, they grow up and they have parents, then you don't think about your parents having sex ever.
Right.
You kind of start repressing it as a kid.
Right. And I think with parental help.
With parental help. Yeah.
Because they don't want us to be thinking that way, or they refuse to, kiss in front of the children. And it seems to me, even here in the 2020s, we're going through a rather protracted neo-Victorianism. And the Victorians, for those who don't know, were those during the reign of Queen Victoria, who were quite sexually repressed, to the point where even pianos had to wear skirts, because otherwise the naked legs would be on display.
That's true.
Yeah. It was just considered good etiquette to cover up
now
those legs.
Now I know why those piano legs always
bothered
me.
Yeah, so everything was, and the state of, when you repress anything like that, the state of arousal goes way up when you're accidentally exposed to something like as sexual as, say, an ankle, an unclothed ankle, or a whole forearm of a woman. And it's happened in Iran with ayatollahs, and shooting women who aren't wearing head coverings because their hair would be so beautiful, and that beautiful hair would cause him or another man to sin by having lustful thoughts, and therefore she's the problem. It couldn't possibly be him. So it's not just America, but it is all over the world, where we either take sex for granted as something that'll just take care of itself, and it really doesn't,
Mm-hmm.
or we repress it because we believe it's dangerous and evil, and it needs to be highly regulated.
And that repression, you say a lot of times that which is repressed will then be expressed inappropriately. You say,
yeah, and I mispronounced the words deliberately. That which is repressed will be expressed inappropriately, and I think that's kind of true. If you look at the typical sex offender in the United States, it's a white male with an above average level of education who happens to be religious.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the demographic of the most sexually repressed people in our country.
What do the churches have to say about that?
They're remarkably quiet. I mean, the implied warranty on church attendance is that it's going to help you have a better life. It'll help you raise your children in a better way. Mm-hmm. And that following God the way we understand him will help you be more successful across the board and, across multiple spectrums of life. And when it comes to sexuality, that's simply not true. It doesn't help, because when it comes to religion, sexuality is addressed only in the form of the thou shalt nots. Mm-hmm. Don't do this, don't do that, don't do that, don't do that. And thus endeth the lesson. So as long as you don't do all these things, you should be fine. But nobody's explaining, okay, well then how should I live sexually? Well, just don't do anything until you get married, and you'll be fine.
Yeah.
But that's not really a great way to...
it's not really specific.
Well, it doesn't guide anybody, really.
And it's dangerous for the women. Like, I've talked to women who had that, and then the guy thinks they could do whatever they want to her. And then...
After the wedding, you mean? Or?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then it's just like, well, now I own you, kind of.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Well, there's an issue right there,
that's
too.
What I've heard, at least from women who were in the situation. And then it's almost like, their potential for being raped by their partner. And because it's,
yeah. So
it's not good.
This whole thing about America and sexuality, it only matters more, I think, not in terms of human misery, but it matters more because America is something of a leader in the world because of its size and wealth, and what we do so often influences people. An example of that would be all the missionaries we have sent off to Africa who have communicated religious truths, so-called truths, to countries like Uganda, where now homosexuality is considered a capital crime. So these sexual rules that come out of the Judeo-Christian heritage being visited on cultures that have had nothing to do with that tradition really, I think, has created more problems that we've exported across the planet to others. And in this area, America is not really doing all that well. I wish we were doing better. We can do better, but it's hard to do better with any problem when you can't even talk about it. Yeah. I think about Clinton. He had a Surgeon General, Jocelyn Elders, who suggested during the AIDS epidemic that young people should consider masturbation as part of their sexual maintenance or sexual lifestyle. And she was forced to resign in shame over that assertion.
Because, meanwhile, Bill's getting...
Yeah, meanwhile, of course. Meanwhile, back at the White House. And it's just crazy when you think about this behavior that's, for all intents and purposes, has to be universal, masturbation. And even religious people have made jokes like, studies show that 95% of all people masturbate, or all teenagers masturbate. The remaining 5% are liars. Mm-hmm. And so it's a joke that we lie about it, but it's a joke that sadly has a foundation in a lot of human misery, where people feel like they've sinned, they've done something horrible, they've done something wrong, something nobody else is doing, or if anybody else is doing it, it's all the people who are going to hell. And it's no one religion, it's really all of them. If you're, for the listener out there, if you're in front of a computer sometime, just look up religion and masturbation. That's an interesting Wikipedia article on what all the different religions of the world have to say about masturbation. And that's masturbation. That's something that's between you and you. It's not, nobody else gets hurt, nobody's involved, but it's really looked at with a jaundiced eye by the religions of the world.
Yeah, that's crazy. And then if you're a kid doing that and you're feeling bad all the time, I would imagine that, I don't know, like even from my own experience, I don't know how it like subconsciously worked in on me. I mean, I grew up Catholic and I really didn't follow any of it. I don't even know what exactly went on half the time because I was just in my own head during the mass and I wasn't paying attention to really what was happening because I was so bored and not interested in the material. But it still was something there that you're thinking a little bit like, I don't know if I should be doing this or this is wrong.
Oh, yeah.
And then it's like, then you do that over and over again. Eventually you make it right in your own head.
I've talked to so many thousands of people individually who've gone through that process, and many of them are not religious, but these teachings are in the atmosphere, the ether that we breathe. And people, typically young people starting to masturbate, already feel like I'm doing something wrong.
Yeah.
I shouldn't be doing this. And instead of, being open to experiencing their body and experiencing their sexuality at that beginner's level, so to speak, or maybe I could say intermediate level, because they've been sexual beings since they've been born, male and female, and they've obviously already been very curious and they've been learning a lot, watching what's going on around them. And so when puberty hits, they reach a new level of sexuality that's more engaged and more, more adult. But they really are unprepared for this. And, what's so weird about all of this too is that of all the things we should be teaching young people, we teach them driver's education, we teach them how to manage finances and all of these other things, trying to prepare them for the world of work. But we don't teach them about managing their own sexuality, managing their love lives. Yes, we have sex ed. And I continue to ask even my youngest clients who just finished high schools less than a year ago, and they all say it hasn't changed. It's still essentially a mechanistic model based on anatomy and physiology. This is a penis. This is a vagina. This is what it does. This is how people get pregnant. And this is how babies are born. Oh, and then not to forget, and these are the ways that you can catch diseases. So, and that's sexuality.
Yeah.
But most of us don't experience sexuality that way. We experience it in the context of a human relationship, and no one is talking about that sort of thing. Like, well, what would make for a healthy relationship? Because that's the first step toward having a healthy sexual relationship. And we don't explain that to our young people. And I don't think there's even a good religious reason for that in terms of people, in terms of religion's doctrine, unless you go back to the Enlightenment and that period where, but that's not for science to talk about. That's not for reason to discuss. That's under the purview of religion. Except that religion has never explained that we must first have a safe relationship before we can have a good relationship.
Yeah.
Religion has never defined what is a good relationship. What would that look like? Religion has never taught anyone, well, we're all far more alike than we are different, so we all have universal needs that we share, but we also have unique personal needs. And that although some person might be great for somebody else, they might not be great for you. And so we're left to figure this all out on our own. And it's it creates so much needless suffering. And again, it goes back to the Enlightenment. And I think it's time for the rest of us to send humanity's army back to the battlefield of the Enlightenment and try to rescue the wounded who are still lying out there on the battlefield, because we failed to stick up for human sexuality as a legitimate field of study and a field where even reason itself still applies, as in you have to have a safe relationship before you can have a good relationship.
Yeah.
That isn't something science taught me. That's just reason itself teaches you that. But nobody in any church I've ever been in has heard a sermon on domestic violence and how to have a way of perceiving that without actually getting hit. Because by the time you're hit, it's a little too late.
Yeah.
So how can you tell if somebody is given to domestic violence, male or female, to controlling behaviors? Because if you're with people who are controlling, then it's not going to feel safe, even if there is no physical violence.
And you could detect that earlier on if you're aware of that stuff.
Absolutely.
The hit doesn't come right away. It's not like the first date. Let's go back to my apartment. All right, close the door. Bam.
Right. I mean, and that has happened, of course.
Yes.
As soon as we say that, I mean, there'll be a listener who say, well, that happened. Yeah, that did happen to my sister, or that did happen to somebody I know. And I know that it has. But
I'd imagine it's a lot more rare.
Absolutely, because not to get back to that subject of abuse so much, but it's a matter of percentages. The odds of a person being hit go way up when that person keeps dating control freaks. So if I'm not dating control freaks, my odds of domestic violence go way down. And likewise, if I can abstain from becoming or maintaining my identity as a control freak, the odds of domestic violence go way down. So, but we don't teach people the basics of human psychology and the basics of human relationships. And that is where sexuality manifests itself for the most part. It's not generally a matter for brothels.
Do you think schools should teach different subjects, like in high school?
Different subjects?
Like math, English, science. Like, do you think that, because they don't teach psychology in high school, or at least it didn't when I was in high school. Maybe they do now.
I don't think they really do teach that, but your question intrigued me because it had to do with, what's the right way to set up schools. And I don't know if it's right to divide knowledge into different categories. I'm not sure if that's the only way to do it. I do like the idea of consilience, and it seems especially true as a concept that's needed where all knowledge could come together to give us a full picture of the truth when it comes to human sexuality. I would say the humanities have a lot to say about human sexuality, and so do the sciences. But I think when the humanities and the sciences get together and really see mankind or humankind for who and what it is, they would realize collectively that they have done a tremendous disservice by not helping out for those lost, wretched individuals who have not received any instruction in their lives from either source. And we could do that. We could do that in a way that's far more humane. And I think we could perfect delivering that knowledge so that everybody would know, hey, if you get together in a relationship with somebody who has a drinking problem, that's really going to be challenging to ever develop that into a healthy relationship.
Yeah.
And even that very simple truth never gets shared, say, in a sex education program.
Yeah.
Or in any other part of school that I'm aware of, in junior high school or high school.
Do you think that it's
or college, for that matter? It never gets shared in college.
Yeah. Well, I definitely think that, like we talked about before in our episode, the real sex ed, that it would be so beneficial to have a class like this. But then I start thinking about the parents too. Like if you're the teacher and you write on the board like masturbation or something, right. And then it's like the kid goes home and tells his parents that's
today we talked about masturbation.
And it's like, what?
Yeah.
Like, I don't know. Like, even if you're like 16 or something, I could see people like maybe having or it's controversial, or the person teaching that really has to be kind of vetted, probably, because some teachers could get in there that shouldn't be teaching kids these subject matters.
A long time ago, I read a novel in which it was set in the time of when men who were enslaved were often turned into eunuchs. And the discussion of eunuchs as sexual partners came up, and they were considered better lovers. Why? Oh, because they weren't fixated on the penis and genital stimulation. So
eunuchs, you mean they had no genitals?
Well, it depends on the procedure, how they were used, but they didn't have testicles for sure. And some eunuchs they'd had the whole thing removed, everything in the male sex organs. So when we think about sex education, if you're a sex educator, could you educate young people to have healthy sexuality without talking about anatomy and physiology? I think it would be a better sex education, personally, because you could set it, and it would be less offensive to the religious community if we were simply to talk about relationships. But I suspect that there would come a whiplash or a backlash effect where churches would become upset because you're teaching children something that normally would fall under our purview, how they should live their lives. But I don't think too many churches would argue about teaching children about the perils of domestic violence and how to have a safe relationship, how to resolve conflicts fairly, safely, and without violence. I don't think most churches would find themselves in an enviable position trying to defend against talking about what real love looks like. And so I think sex education could do a whole lot better, and particularly now that we've evolved to a place as a society where everybody has access to the internet. And if children wanted to know more about genitalia, that's a click away. And the same thing with diseases and pregnancy and all the rest of it. And for teachers to simply say, if you have any questions about the specifics of your body or the bodies of others and how that all works, you're welcome to look on the internet, and so then you're not saying anything controversial, I hope, reminding children there is an internet, not that they need that reminder, but, for people then to focus on, well, what makes for a healthy love life? And to talk even now, this is something that would be controversial in a lot of churches, and that would be dating. That when you're dating someone, these would be the things that you would be looking out for. Somebody with a drinking problem, for example, or somebody who's rude and abusive to the servers, at a restaurant. Why would that matter? Well, if they're rude and abusive to some, what's going to keep them from being rude and abusive to you later on? And if that isn't part of their ethics or their own moral code, then why would they ever restrain themselves when it comes to abusing you? And I think a lot of churches would have a hard time with that little piece of it.
And then again, with so what about going outside of high schools and things like that? Do you feel like people have, it seems to me at least, I don't know if this is true, but do you feel like people have some sort of attitude where they're like, don't tell me how to have a relationship?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
I think that
until
also,
life slams you to the mat a few dozen times, and you go, I really need some help with this.
All right.
And unless you're one of the very amazingly lucky few, and we all hear about them from time to time, the high school sweethearts who got together and they're celebrating their 100th anniversary or something. And it's crazy, and they're still in love and they still are having a great time. But the research on even those individuals is that typically when asked by researchers, what kept you from getting a divorce over the years? It's usually the answer is going to be about money.
Okay. Yeah.
Not because the love was so amazing or the relationship itself was so great. It's very rare. And as would make sense, right? Because it's challenging to think of being truly happy in a relationship where you have nothing in common and there's no compatibility.
Yeah.
And even teaching young people those terms, taking a look at compatibility, for example. But I think once some child raises his or her hand in school and says, but my parents think it's important to marry somebody from the same church. What do you say, teacher? I think the teacher is going to be in a challenging position there, because the truth would be that intimacy doesn't depend on our being identical with one another, but on our being respectful and loving with one another. So theoretically, a Buddhist and a Hindu could have a great marriage, or a religious person and an atheist could have a great marriage if it was based on equality and it was abuse free. I don't see why they couldn't have a great relationship.
Yeah, that's again another collective discomfort, I feel like.
Right. There would be a lot of controversy over some of these issues, but the teacher could also say something like, I'm not allowed to talk about that right now. You'll have to think about that yourself, and to decide, if that's an essential part of an intimate relationship or not. And to define intimacy as this is a way of sharing our lives with one another, but doing it safely. Because if we're not doing it safely, it's not very pleasant. And it's not going to be growthful. It's not going to get better over time if it's not safe. So I think kids are smart, and they could figure things out with just the littlest bit of guidance.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I always still remember being a kid. I feel like a lot of people forget it, but I remember being a student and what it was like, and I could think back like it was yesterday. I don't have like a rigidity in my mind to where I'm like block it out, where some people I feel like some people do.
Well, I just remember from those days that I knew nothing, but I had a lot of raw emotional neediness. What do you remember
from school?
From those teenage years, yeah.
A lot of it, I remember it being really boring, like school. I remember being just, school was boring, but I remember teachers who were real with me. I mostly remember real teachers who were not putting on an act. And those going back from first grade in kindergarten, I remember even the teachers I had that were cool and the ones that were not cool and that actually taught and that were loving and that kind of were acting like they were sharing, like they treat you like an equal. I guess that's what it is. And we talk about equality a lot here. And I think those are the teachers that I really gravitated towards. And then school, I mean, the kids situation was just a mess. I mean, with the kids and the society of the cliques that they had. Oh yeah. And the social life, the fights that were happening, and all that sort of stuff was just ridiculous. And I just kind of stayed out of as much as I can, did the school stuff, finished all my homework as fast as possible, and then I went outside to play.
You're right.
It's
yeah, I was a little workaholic who would finish my homework actually at school.
So would I, yeah.
And then go home.
Yeah.
And it seemed like a nice clean break. I didn't have to deal with it after that, getting the work done. But I remember too, those amazing teachers who would talk to me as if I were an intellectual peer.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly it.
Yeah. And they really rocked my consciousness.
Yeah. That's why I think having a class like this and talking about these things, I would definitely have remembered that.
Yeah. And yet, it's funny. It's sort of like managing love intelligently. I think all of us, once we think about it, would think, oh, that's a good idea, right? I don't want to be managing it unintelligently or not managing it at all, just where it just happens. And I kind of live with the consequences. And I think having a sex ed program that focuses on less intercourse, less about diseases and pregnancy, but more about the human side of it, the relationship context, I think that would be something most parents would think, that I would love for my kids to get that.
Yeah, I just thought of something funny. You know how they make the woman carry around the baby sometimes?
Oh, yeah.
It's they could also have the woman being abused by a guy, maybe he shows up at her locker, slams it shut, and he's like, "What are you doing talking to Jim over there?" Really ridiculous.
That's awful. Your
Yeah.
sense of humor is sick.
But the woman could do it to the guy too. Like she could be like, "Nah, you're not having sex tonight, Bill," and then she's like, "Get out!" I'm like, I don't know. It would just be in my mind. It's just funny.
I wouldn't want it out in the hallway like you're thinking about by the locker, but I would think that it would be really easy to set up role playing.
Yeah, that would be a fun part of it.
That would be a really fun part, like where somebody's been abusive and you role playing confronting that person with their abuse.
Yeah.
And then to have a discussion right after that role play.
Yeah.
And then to do it again and again and again until people kind of can start breathing and relaxing around these subjects instead of feeling so, on the spot because everybody's looking at me.
Yeah.
And to be able to think it through. So our discomfort with human sexuality in this country is not unique. It's really similar, I think, to across the world. The problem is we have so much outsized influence in the world that other nations are copying some of our worst traits and our worst laws. And we're ending up with, I think, a world that is not better for some of the mistakes that we're making and that we export via religion or via religiously inspired ideas on things I don't personally believe in, like sex addiction, or even talking about how to intelligently manage sexual criminality. It seems for me as a person with a forensic practice, it seems to me that our laws regulating sexuality are horrible and are horribly enforced, and that our cure is far worse than the disease most of the time, because we're not really doing a very good job of managing our sexuality as a nation.
Yeah. And then how do we close this gap of this discomfort? Like, I think the school thing would be huge, teaching this to students. And then also we've talked about before, parents modeling sexuality in front of their kids, bringing
that's scary when you put it that way. Oh,
bringing a newspaper article up.
Modeling that it's okay to talk about.
Okay to talk about. But again, I think that would close the gap of the discomfort with it.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
It needs to be just discussed. I think having conversations like this, help. And
if you did that 50 times a year, approximately once a week, times 10 years.
Yeah, they'd have no problem talking about sex or sexuality.
Just reading from the paper. That's 500 conversations that they've overheard about human sexuality being brought up just at home. And I think at that point,
there's a good one now with Trump and the porn star. That's a perfect example that they could bring up.
Oh my God. Well, okay. You're edgier maybe than some parents. I don't know. But you're right. I mean, it's a parental decision.
It's an article in there.
It is an article in the front page of the paper. Yeah. And I read an article today that said something about shame is a thing of the past when it comes to porn stars and paying, for sex. And I remember the tremendous shame that Bill Clinton went through and the humiliation of his wife and all of that. And we've flipped the script entirely. And some people, I have read, some people who are religious blame religions for the loyalty that they've had to Trump has caused them to modulate their condemnation of the behavior. And I think, again, that's an indicator that even in the world of politics, we're looking for religion as if it were the salvation for how we should behave ethically when it comes to sexuality. And I think the track record of religion over the last few thousand years has been, they're not really that good at it.
Yeah.
I think we could improve upon it enormously. And I know science isn't perfect, but the great thing about science and reason for that matter is that both are self-correcting over time. And so you start wherever you start and things get better over time. Whereas religion tends to be very conservative in defending the past and defending the doctrines of the faith. And so I think letting the the Enlightenment have its natural outcome when it comes to human behavior and human sexuality would be an enormous benefit for the world.
What do you feel about the president talking about sex and sexuality? Do you think the president has any influence on culture, society, the way we think, and that sort of thing?
No.
Okay. So it wouldn't help.
Well, no, I don't really think it would help. I think, so there's an old saying that children learn a little bit they learn nothing by what you say. They learn a little bit by what you do, but mostly children learn from who you are. Mm. So if you're a kind person, for example, children learn kindness is a value and that's the right thing to do. And if children learn about tolerance in the same way, then they start getting that lesson into their heads. And when we manifest our values, not by preaching about them, but by being that way, then I think people have a much better chance of being influenced, even by presidents. Because I noticed this current president, he's got a wicked sense of humor. He's very funny, but he's also got a real love of tolerance. And he actually thinks everybody born in America is an American. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't matter what their gender is. It doesn't matter what their sexual orientation is. He thinks everybody should have the same rights. If you can imagine what a radical concept. And I think that he's rather special in that regard. Mm. And I'm not hearing that same message from the other side of the aisle. Mm. But I look forward to the day when I do.
Yeah. And then what would your view of, like, say years have passed and the collective discomfort has now been a collective comfort with sex?
Okay, yeah.
What would that look like from your viewpoint? Like, how would society be in that?
There would be almost zero need for a podcast like this because it would be taught, everything that we talk about would be taught at an age-appropriate level in the public schools.
So it would just be common knowledge. Like you mentioned one time about like directions or travel or something with Magellan. I don't know. You're looking at me blank. You mentioned something about that it becomes so normalized. Like it becomes it just becomes like eating healthy food or just.
Oh yeah. Because, I actually talk about Magellan in a couple of different ways, but when you go on a trip around the world, before the discovery of vitamins and any knowledge about nutrition, it's really easy to suffer a vitamin deficiency and to have horrible diseases break out, like say from a deficiency in vitamin C, which was super common, right? Through the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s. And eventually this becomes common knowledge, and almost every educated person has an approximate idea of how much vitamin C they need to take in on a daily basis. And wouldn't that be an amazing thing if we all knew ourselves well enough to know, yes, in general, I share these human needs with other humans. I have a need for intellectual stimulation. I have a need for love in my life, and I have a need for respect, or I'm not going to feel safe, and I have a need for, developing a career, and all these other needs that we humans have. But then I have my own peculiar needs that separate me from some other people, in that I'm heterosexual, or I'm homosexual, or I'm heterosexual and I really can't stand smokers. Mm-hmm. And so we start fine-tuning our own personal idiosyncrasies into a more coherent sense of self. And we know that, this person could work, this person absolutely won't work.
Yeah.
And we would be far more efficient and effective, and I think successful in the long run, in developing loving relationships that really work for all of us. That would be my fantasy. And my fantasy would include a big science fiction component of, and we discover the cures for treating people with narcissistic personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, even including the people who really don't want help, Because those are individuals really are incapable of love.
Yeah.
And yet simultaneously need love in order to be normal. So it creates all kinds of difficulties, at least for the other person who has the misfortune of marrying them.
Do you think, and that also, I think just that collective comfort with sex could probably change, again, media, billboard, I don't know, like the whole.
Things would change. I would imagine that we would still have, sex used in advertising, but it would probably be very different.
Yeah.
Instead of showing something that's merely titillating, to be showing people who are loving and kind with each other. The McDonald's Corporation had a great commercial about, going to a McDonald's and having a great time, great conversation. And it was a father and his son. And the father was set in Paris, of all places. And the father and his son were talking about dating, and the father had some questions. And then he got up to go get the food, or to get their order. And then the son was looking down at his phone. It was a text, I think, from another kid, only the kid happened to be a boy because the son was gay. And it was handled in such a really appropriate, loving, respectful way that nobody got put down, and it wasn't all titillation based as, say, pornography is.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking back to what I just said about the science fiction aspect and having a cure, even if people didn't want the cure for these mental health problems. But I don't think that would be necessary, because if we educated the rest of the population, I think eventually people would stop dating them, marrying them, and having children with them.
So you're trying to make these people extinct. That's what you're doing.
It's a dream.
Well, great. That was a fun conversation.
Yeah, it was.
So we could wrap that up there. And yeah, I just think it's such an interesting thing about all of our society and how we think about sex and the discomfort of it, and just getting more comfortable with it.
Well, I hope the people listening to this are comfortable with it, but not so comfortable that they find this conversation boring. That's one of my secret fears, is that I'll succeed in making sex such a comfortable topic of conversation, and so comfortable I turned it into a boring subject.
But doesn't comfort doesn't comfort lead to safety? And that then
it can, but if you have so much safety that it's boring.
I drop in some jokes. You drop in some jokes. You just said you wanted people to go extinct. I think that's going to keep them.
You think that's funny?
I think that's... Well, that will keep them on the edge.
Right. The sexual futurist has a eugenics program.
Yeah. All right. To wrap up, we have a listener question, as always. And if you have a question for Steve, visit stevening.com and fill out the contact form. This week's question is... My husband is sneaking porn. I haven't said anything because I'm hurt and disgusted by what I saw, and I didn't want to say anything I would regret. Now I'm also angry about the secrecy. What should I say to him?
And it's signed 10 million angry women.
Yeah.
This is such a common scenario, right? And it's kind of ties into our conversation we were just talking about, where people don't feel comfortable talking about these things. So, ideally, what would be so uncomfortable for her to say, hey, I walked into your office the other day after you just left, and I noticed porn was on the computer. What's going on? And to have that conversation, I don't think would be so terribly hard. It might be hard for her because maybe she's been cracking passwords and hacking into his accounts and things like that. But even that, to say, hey, I need to apologize to you. I was feeling so weird. I ended up spying on you, and I'm really, really sorry. While I was spying on you, I found out something about your interest in porn. And someday soon, I hope you and I can talk about that. And then done. Because the apology is the main thing in that circumstance. You need to bring it up. But I think you also need to be talking about, so what does it mean? And it means so many different things. because, and I've seen this in my office countless times, a man can be looking at something pornographic or reading an erotic story or watching a video, and it's about something he's not even sexually interested in, but it has an element of something he's sexually interested in. So whether he likes men or women or both, or neither, it really doesn't matter. To me, it's about the joy of understanding. And I would recommend to this wife and the other 10 million that it's really not about you. It's about him. And it's a side of him that you don't know about or understand. And if you want to know if you want to know him and understand him, you can't go in there like the sex police, wagging your finger in shame and telling him, about the terrible thing he did and taking it all personally. You have to detach and let go, because it's not about you. And you may find these truths uncomfortable, and you may decide to dump him. I mean, after all, most of us men are surprised women want anything to do with us anyway. And especially the woman we love, we're kind of shocked she wants to be seen with us in public. But to be able to really get to know him requires detachment and one other ingredient. And I would think that other ingredient is love. Because whether he's coloring within the lines or way outside the lines, he is a human being, and he's a human being with a lot of lovable traits, or you wouldn't be with him in the first place. So going into that conversation with detachment and love is what I would recommend. And please don't make it one conversation. Please make it fairly brief, like under an hour, and bring it up again and again as a point of interest. And be prepared, by the way, to reciprocate with sharing some of your own sexual fantasies. And I've had many women in my office who say, but I never have any sexual fantasies. Mm-hmm. So we haven't talked too much about this, I don't think. And a sexual fantasy, for clinical sake, is simply a thought that gives you sexual pleasure. Mm-hmm. So for the missus, if the idea of running into a youthful Sean Connery or the always handsome George Clooney or any other person turns you on and makes you giddy with delight, that is a sexual fantasy. Mm-hmm. So whatever your sexual fantasies are, and if you don't know your sexual fantasies, might I suggest to the missus who wrote this, it might be worthwhile talking to your girlfriends about their sexual fantasies, and eventually maybe to go to a therapist on your own, because if you think you don't have sexual fantasies, it's probably the case that you don't really know yourself and you haven't gotten comfortable talking about or even thinking about your own sexuality. So there you go.
All right. Well, thank you for that question, listener. And thank you, Steve, as always. And we will see you all next week. Thank you and goodbye.